Hello everyone, welcome to the South Coast Reptiles YouTube channel. In today's episode we're going to be going over all the care requirements for the African Fat Tail Gecko. For all those people out there just thinking about getting an African Fat Tail Gecko or considering it, we're going to be going through all the information such as the temperatures, the heating, the lighting, feeding, all them kind of things. We're going to cover all that so you know how to take care of your African Fat Tail Gecko and they'll be able to live a nice and happy life in your care. So to start this video off, a bit of background information about the African Fat Tail Gecko. Obviously the African Fat Tail Gecko is very closely related to the more commonly kept leopard gecko and their care requirements are very similar. However, there are some key differences in this. But obviously being from Africa, you'll find the African Fat Tail Gecko is very nocturnal. They don't very like to venture during the middle of the day. Obviously, sometimes they will venture out during the day. Some people have seen it. Some people say that African Fat Tail Geckos do like to come out during the day. But most of the time with Oreo, we find he is much more nocturnal. He only really comes out late night. So probably you're talking about 8, 9 p.m. when it gets dark and, you know, then he starts to feel more comfortable and he comes out during them times naturally. Obviously, moving on to the first one we're going to talk about is the enclosure sizes. Now, enclosure sizes can be different. Different people have different closures. Some use glass, plastic. I think it's called MVP or something. And then obviously you've got wooden vivariums. We use wooden vivariums because they're mainly the cheapest and what we find is the best thing to use for them. But going on from that, the one we use is a Vivsotic 3 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot. So that's 3 foot long by 1 foot deep and 1 foot wide. But this is what we use for an adult African Fat Tail Gecko. Obviously, if you've got babies, juveniles, Oreo's quite a small fat tail. But obviously, if you're talking about juveniles and babies, you can keep them in smaller setups. As long as you can keep all the requirements, like the heating and that, as long as you keep it all stable, you can keep them in smaller setups. But obviously, for us, we recommend a 3 foot or something of a similar size to a 3 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot, just because it gives him the space to move around and explore, hunt, thermoregulate himself. So just all little things to keep him happy and he can enjoy his life. So moving on to number 2, the second thing we're going to talk about is going to be their heating. We use an Arcadia deep heat projector. We use a 50 watt one, and with the 50 watt one on it, we got a dimming thermostat, and we have the dimming thermostat set at 31 degrees on this basking spot during the day. So 31 degrees on the basking spot. Around the hot end of his enclosure will be around the high 20s, so you talk about between 27 to 30, and then obviously his cool end can go all the way down sometimes like 21, 20 during the day. Obviously there is a little bit of a night drop at night because we turn all the temperatures down a little bit, so at night time we set his basking temperature up to 24 degrees. Obviously using a deep heat projector, it doesn't emit any light, so it doesn't matter it being on during the night because obviously he can't see it. It doesn't interact with his day-night cycle at all. Obviously, moving into day-night cycles, what kind of lighting do we use? We use an Arcadia T5 UVB unit, and we use that with a shade dweller bulb. So this is what we use just to give him his day-night cycle. Obviously, the DP projector doesn't emit any heat, such as like a halogen bulb, so we use that to give him UVB and also to give him his day-night cycle. So what we do is we do 12 hours on, 12 hours off. So normally I'd get up for work about 6 o'clock in the morning, so I'd put his heating on at 6 and his lights on at 6. And then when I come home from work, I'd then turn the lights off. So actually the only time I get to see him during the day with his lights on is during the weekend. So this is quite nice to be able to see him during the weekend. But moving on from that, temperatures, obviously going to move on to humidity, because that's quite an important thing, something that's a bit different to their cousins. They do like a more humid environment. So for your African Fat Tail Gecko, you're talking about a humidity of between 40 to 60% on a normal day. Obviously, this can fluctuate. You know, if you're a little bit lower or a little bit higher, it's not the end of the world. But obviously, those are the kind of ballpark figures you're aiming for. So as long as you're aiming for near enough them regions, you will be perfectly fine. You know, just don't keep them at 100% humidity all day every day, or keep them at 20% humidity all day every day, because then you will get into issues such as breathing issues. I'm just going to say that because I can't say the word. And also you can, if the humidity ain't high enough, you can get issues with stuck shed, and stuck shed on their toes is quite a big issue with African Fat Tail Geckos, just for you to keep an eye on in the future if you do decide to get one. So next thing we're going to move on to in the video is their diet. Obviously, African Fat Tail Gecko is a purely insectivore diet. It's like Timon and Pumbaa from Africa as well. But obviously, being a pure insectivore diet, you know, your main staples of feeding these is going to be, depending on where you're from, will be crickets, mealworms, locusts, dubia roaches, superworms, Maria worms, all them bugs basically. It's all bugs, all different kinds of worms or locusts or crickets, and that is going to be their staple for their meal. Now, with a baby African fat tail, you are going to be looking at feeding 3 or 4 appropriately sized insects. By I mean appropriate sizes, basically they can't be wider than the width between their eyes, because if they're wider, they can be quite a struggle for them to eat them. So 3 or 4 appropriately sized insects a day would be more than sufficient for a baby African fat tail gecko. But then obviously, if you start moving on into the adults, you can space out the feeding a bit more, so you can feed every 2 to 3 days. And just the same as the babies, 3, 4, 5 like good sized insects, and that will perfectly do them. So moving on from feeding, we're going to go on to supplementations. So obviously, same as any reptile lizards, any geckos like leopard geckos, African fat tail geckos, bearded dragons. In the captivity, we do require to supplement their diet. So what I mean by that is you just use your supplementation. So obviously you look online, find all different keys and ingredients. So like for example, this is what we use. This is what we use for both Lizzie, the leopard gecko, and for Oreo, the fat tail gecko. So it's just Calcium Pro from Earth Pro. That's something like an Arcadia product again. I know we seem to like Arcadia products here. But obviously that's what we use for Oreo and Lizzie, and they're both perfectly fine, perfectly healthy. Never had any issues with them at all because they're feeding. So you need to give them this supplementation, because obviously if you don't, you do increase the risk of diseases such as metabolic bone disease, and obviously that's just something you don't want, because once they get it, it's permanent. You can't get rid of it, and that just, it's not a nice way to live. So obviously just keep on top of their supplementation. A light dusting will do. Just light dusting on top of their feeder insects for that day. Perfectly adequate, perfectly fine, and that'll keep them all up to date with their supplements and make sure they live nice and healthy. The last main point we're going to be going over, which is kind of an extra, is their handling. Now, I've had Oreo now for 3 months now, I think, and it has taken me, mindful, to set the cameras up, check stuff and do stuff. I've had Oreo for about 20 minutes now, and he is still perfectly relaxed, perfectly fine. He's not flighty in the slightest. You know, he just moves effortlessly, and they're not quick. So like, this isn't the reptile, you know, you've got to be worried about, like if you put him on your hand, you haven't got to be worried about sprinting up a wall or running away from you. He's just perfectly happy, perfectly content, just walking, exploring what's around him. He's perfectly fine, happy with that. They are so easy to handle. Obviously, there can be outliers. You can get some which will be really flighty, don't want to be handled, and you could possibly get really aggressive ones. But on the whole, in general, they are very good, and they're very handleable, and they're easy to handle. Obviously, the only exception to this is obviously they are soft-bodied reptile. So even though they have scales and they have obviously got their skin and that, they can't, for example, a bearded dragon you can hold quite firmly. But obviously an African fat tail gecko, I wouldn't advise grasping your African fat tail gecko. Just simply like this, just scoop them up from underneath and then just let them move around on you, rather than so much as you moving them around, just so that they're comfortable. And obviously you've got no harm. You can't injure them if they're just walking on you. But if you start handling them quite aggressively, they can get injured. Or if you accidentally grab their tail, for example, because they can detach their tail. So if you grab their tail, they might shed their tail, and then obviously they will regrow, but it will never regrow the same. It looks lumpy. It just looks like, it's kind of like when the name comes from, African fat tail, yeah, because when they regrow their tails, they're just really big and lumpy, and they don't look the same. Where are you going? But yeah, but apart from that, perfectly handleable, and honestly, a real treat to have. Obviously, these are rarer than your leopard geckos, and they're a bit harder to come by, a bit more expensive, but I must say, they are worth every penny. They're amazing lizards. They're not overly expensive to set up. I mean, the whole Oreo and the setup probably cost me around £500. And for that, you get an amazing reptile, which is going to last you, you know, the life expectancy of these can be 10, 15 years. So this is a very, very worthy investment. They're not very expensive to keep. So overall, I'd say they are a pretty decent lizard. But I think that'll be all from us today. Hey, Oreo. So we're going to say goodbye, and that'll be it from us, and we'll catch you in the next one.